What criminal committed an almost perfect crime, and what was the thing that messed it up? Story 1. The Dunbar Armored Robbery. The largest cash heist in US history, a six-man inside job to rob an armored cash depot. They set up a house party as an alibi, used the keys to get into the cafeteria, and waited in there until all employees came in on break, then ambushed and subdued them without firing a shot or raising an alarm. They then loaded the money bags, with over $18 million into a U-Haul, destroyed the CCTV tapes and returned to the party. Then they sat on the money for 6 months, before hiring a crooked lawyer to set up a real estate money laundering scheme to avoid suspicion. 2 years after the robbery, one of the men paid a real estate broker with a stack of money, still wrapped in the original currency strap. The broker immediately reported it to the police. After being arrested, he cracked under interrogation, confessed to the robbery, and ratted out his partners, Edith. All the men have since finished their prison sentences, and most of the money was never found, so there's a chance they still won in the end. Story 2. The Antwerp Diamond Heist, the perfect heist of the century, where an Italian gang stole 100 million in gems. While leaving Antwerp, they disposed of the disguises and the tools used, but one member of the gang was too lazy to burn everything as instructed. Among the rubbish, the police found envelopes of the Antwerp Diamond Centre and a receipt for a sandwich bought at a store close to the centre. They recovered video footage of the sandwich store and busted the mastermind of the heist, who didn't give up his mates, but some were later identified. Some of the stolen diamonds are still unaccounted for. Story 3. In 1995, Mark Winger of Springfield, IL, wanted to kill his wife Donna, IARC, so he could carry on an affair, and the perfect scenario came. A week before her death, Roger Harrington was her shuttle driver on the way home from the St. Louis airport, and he reportedly spoke about always getting high and having orgies. In turn, the Wingers complained to the shuttle company. Then, Mark calls the police, claiming that he shot Roger after he caught him attacking Donna. Despite the contradiction of Roger being shot in a way that Mark did not claim happened, the case was shut, and Mark was viewed as a hero for killing the man who killed his wife. However, in his infinite wisdom, Mark wouldn't stop asking the police about the case, despite it being ruled as closed. Also, he tried to sue the shuttle company for Roger's alleged action, to which the company started their own investigation, which showed that the events couldn't have gone the way Mark described. The final nail came when his affair partner came forward to the police and described their affair, which led to further re-examination of evidence that showed it was staged. Mark was later tried and convicted in 2002 and sentenced to life without parole. In another derp moment from Mark, he was later given an extra 35 years for trying to solicit the murder of his affair partner and his rich friend, who refused to bail him out from behind bars. The main piece of evidence being a 19-page handwritten plan for how he wanted the murders to be carried out. Story 4. Someone robbed a bank a few minutes from my house and fled on a bicycle. He was in and out quickly enough that cops weren't on the scene until he had ditched the bike in the neighborhood. He had concealed his identity enough during the robbery that all the police had to go on is a male riding a bicycle carrying a parcel in the vicinity of this neighborhood. He had made it to a truck he had parked in the neighborhood without being noticed by anyone. The police had little idea what to look for, and by all measure he had made the perfect getaway. All he had to do was drive home. While attempting to leave the neighborhood in his truck, he saw a police vehicle making a patrol, and in a panic, he drove his truck straight into a utility pole. The patrolling officer saw this, went to check on him and found the stolen money in his truck. Story 5. Joseph James DeAngelo, otherwise known as the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, and the Visalia Ransacker. The guy was a one-man crime wave. In a 12-year period, he committed at least 13 murders, 51 rapes, and 120 burglaries. As the East Area Rapist, he would often select his targets months in advance, conduct extensive reconnaissance, learning the routines of the occupants, and sometimes break in advance of his attack to plant his weapons and ligatures, and he would make threatening hang-up calls in advance to create a sense of fear. I won't go into details about his attacks, but he had a whole routine and everything that he would go through. And even though the sketches of him were near enough accurate, and the criminal profile of him was dead on accurate, for example, they correctly identified the attacker as working or having worked in law enforcement and the military, and JJD was a police officer at the time of his crime spree, they never even came close to finding him. When he was arrested, it was the first time he had ever come to the attention of the police. He didn't even have any DNA on file for them to match when that became a thing. That was how good he was at staying off the radar. The reason he got caught? Genealogical testing. You know those test kits that people get from services such as 23andMe and Ancestry? Well, the police ran the DNA samples through a database used by those services and identified his relatives. They eventually found someone closely related enough to him that they could identify him, so he hadn't even submitted his DNA for testing. One of his relatives did. The guy must have been so fucking shocked when the police showed up at his door. Story 6. The Unabomber was the target of what is still the most expensive criminal investigation of all time, and they still had absolutely nothing on him. They were looking in the wrong part of the country for a totally different profile of person, and the few leads they were actually working on were red herrings. He got his manifesto published and used the phrase "eat your cake and still have it," rather than the more commonly known version. His brother David just so happened to read that manifesto and remember how Ted used that phrase. David decides, on a lark, to go through some of the stuff Ted had left at their mum's house and finds an early draft of the manifesto. David, after much soul-searching, decides to report this to the FBI, and they almost throw the lead out before deciding to actually investigate it. Anything at all in that chain doesn't happen. Ted uses a different phrase. David doesn't read the manifesto, or doesn't bother investigating Ted's old stuff, or Ted doesn't leave the draft in Mum's house, or David doesn't tell the FBI, or the FBI toss the lead entirely, and the Unabomber probably stays active to this day. Story 7. Tracy Frame. She murdered her live-in boyfriend by shooting him in his sleep, wrapping his body up in an electric blanket and tarp, and drove a bit out of the way to dump his body in a drainpipe. Couldn't fit him, so she left him on the side of the road, dumped gasoline over him, and set him on fire. He had to be identified with dental records. Police suspected her, but they had no evidence until employees from a janitorial supply company told police and said a woman matching her description came in asking how to get bloodstains out of carpet. They told her to try a specific kind of acid. So, she goes to a store to buy the acid, and the cameras see a woman purchasing on the day of the murder. But the quality of the footage was shitty, so it could be Tracy, or it could be any random white woman with brown hair in the suburbs. The only way they were able to confirm it was Tracy was because she had used her loyalty rewards card on the purchase of the acid to save like 13 cents. Story 8. The Friday night bank robber was the most prolific bank robber in US history. I believe he had a master's degree in something analytical like math, was a martial arts instructor. He figured out there's a time of the year in the Northeast where it would be dark out just before the banks closed. He used motorcycles to drive through the woods to these banks and rode it back through the woods to a U-Haul truck he had waiting and would put the bike into the truck and drive away calmly. He did this for a long time, kind of like the robbers in the movie Point Break. He would stop for the rest of the year, which had the police really guessing. They couldn't figure out patterns for a long time. Years later, the police started to catch on with his idea of doing it on Friday nights in the Northeast, and from video knew he was probably into martial arts. But that doesn't exactly narrow it down. Dumb luck, some random kids stumbled upon his buried cache of things like a gun, gloves, mask, cash, etc. in the woods. They turn it over to the cops, and that's how they ended up finding out who he was. The FBI gave him some deal where he worked with them and banks on telling them how to prevent bank robberies. Story 9. I knew a guy who got into selling drugs on the dark web. He had this setup where he'd buy the drugs and package them in his room, ship them through USPS, and collect money through cryptocurrency. He made a lot of money, went on for a while without being caught. They even found fictionalized accounts he wrote about how he was able to do this, including driving 50 miles to make drops. He was caught when an employee noticed he was handling large numbers of small envelopes while wearing latex gloves and reported it. He probably would have gotten away with it if he'd worn winter gloves over the latex. Story 10. There was an Austrian murderer, Jack Unterweger, who had strangled an 18-year-old woman with her bra. He started writing in prison and getting national notice which led to people campaigning for his release, claiming that he was reformed. He did get released and became a journalist, appearing on TV and commenting on crimes. He covered some murders where women were strangled with their bras. Guess who killed them? He was convicted and immediately killed himself in prison. While working as a journalist, he had gone to LA for a story and went on an LAPD ride-along. It was later established that, during his time there, 3 LA sex workers were strangled with their bras. Story 11. There was this guy in Germany called Shiny Flakes, who sold drugs through the normal internet, not the dark net. He packed and sent them out from his bedroom while living with his mother and stepfather at RRC. He even got his drugs tested to make sure that they are of good quality. He sent the drugs out via mail and only got caught because people used fake names to order and then couldn't pick up their orders from the post office. After he got released from prison, he got involved in some criminal activity again. Story 12. Susan Smith, the one who drowned her kids in her car, she claimed it was a carjacking by a black man. No weapon or witnesses. The cops had nothing but her word. It was a simple traffic light that got her. She claimed that her light was red and there were no other cars at the light. That couldn't be true with a controlled signal. If there was no cross-traffic, her light would not have been red. Story 13. I work in downtown Chicago. Last year, one guy robbed the Fifth Third Bank across the street. He escaped into the Ogilvy Transportation Center and disappeared into the night despite it being so crowded and busy. Got away with the money and everything. Until 3 weeks later, when a woman recognized him as having flirted with her right before he robbed the bank and had given her his phone number. She handed that over to the authorities and he was successfully caught. Story 14. A guy in my city about 30 years ago took advantage of a new tax that came into play in Canada, the GST. There were rebate forms you could fill out, so he created a company with a very similar name to a large construction company. He applied for and was given a $3 million rebate, which he spends over 2 years at a local strip club. He lived at home with his parents. He only got caught because when the money started to run low, he applied again. By this time, the government's checks and balances were better, and he was discovered. Story 15. I knew a man who robbed a bank. A few of them, actually. He got caught when a dye packet was added to his cash. Because his apartment was below ground, they couldn't track the signal, 1990s. Then, the last time, he screwed up and the dye explodes. But he still escapes because of his below-ground apartment. Dumbass gets caught trying to trade in the dye-covered money for clean cash. True story. Story 16. Nelson Serrano was on a business trip from Florida to Atlanta, and according to his perfect alibi, he spent the day in a hotel with a headache. In reality, he'd flown back to Florida, murdered some business associates, and then quickly flew back to Atlanta. He was tripped up when his fingerprints were found on an airport parking receipt from Orlando that was issued around the time of the murders. Well, with that last story, that will be the end of today's video. If you like this type of content and would like more like it, please drop a like and subscribe, as it helps the channel out very much. And if you have any interesting stories of your own, please drop them in the comments. I would be interested to hear them. With that being said, you guys have a good rest of your night, and I'm out.